is Monday, February 25th, 2019. This is an interview with Barb Filas, partner with Filas Engineering and Environmental Services, and a partner of practice at Colorado School of Mines. The interviewer is Tim Arnold. This interview is being conducted as part of the American Institute for Mining, Metallurgical, and Petroleum Engineers Oral History Project. We are recording at the Society for Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration's annual conference in Denver, Colorado, and we're going to discuss her experiences in the mining engineering industry and her contributions to the field. So Barb, tell me about where you grew up.
I was born in Grand Junction, Colorado, a native there. I graduated from high school at Grand Junction High School. So when I got out of school, I hadn't really decided what I wanted to do as a professional. So I went to the local college in Grand Junction. My dad actually bribed me because they asked me what I wanted for my graduation present, and I said I wanted a piano. And they said, well, if you stay and go to Mesa for at least a year, we'll get you a piano for graduation. And if you'd go ahead and go on to Arizona, where I wanted to go just to get out of Colorado, then they'd get me a pen and pencil set. So I went ahead and got the piano, stayed in Grand Junction, took a geology course because I thought that might have been interesting to see if I wanted to get into mining, because I never was very creative in my thought about what I was going to do when I grew up. My mom was a nurse, my dad was a mining engineer, and in high school I worked as a nurse's aide at the local hospital. And when I figured out that you didn't give a patient a glass of water without a doctor's order, I decided I didn't really want to be a nurse because I'd be being told what to do for my whole life. So I looked as far as mining engineering and the University of Arizona, which was my dad's alma mater, and the rest is history. I went over to Arizona after that year at Mesa with my piano.
So tell me a little more about how you got influenced to be a mining engineer, how your dad influenced you into the profession.
I guess it wasn't really my dad that influenced me per se, other than that was his discipline. And he traveled a lot. And as a kid, that's not necessarily a good thing, but because he was away a lot. But I loved to travel, and so I thought that was a pretty neat thing. But he was a little nervous when I said I wanted to go to his alma mater, because he'd gotten an honorary degree from the University of Arizona, and it was all his friends that were in the department. Bill Drescher and Tom O'Neill and all those guys were in the department at the time, and he was so afraid I'd flunk out and humiliate him. So he was pretty nervous about that, but he didn't discourage me, and he supported me, as my mom did too, to go off and give it a shot.
So does your family come from a background of mining?
Well, my dad was a mining engineer, but I think if you step a generation further back, his family immigrated from Sweden and Finland. My grandma was Swedish, my grandfather was Finn, and he immigrated over to the Bisbee area in Arizona to work in the mines. And he died of silicosis. He wasn't an engineer. He died of silicosis when my dad was about 15. And so he started working for trying to get the odd job here and there, working in the wherever he could get a job. And one time the president of Phelps Dodge came through the McNeil area, which was where they lived. And my dad, they got a flat tire, or their car broke down or something like that. So my dad loaded them up, the team up in his family's car, took them down to Douglas, and they decided he was getting ready to go back up, and he didn't have any money to put gas in his car, and he started to cry, and they asked him what was wrong, and he said he didn't have any money to get back up the hill, so they filled him up with gas, and the president of Phelps Dodge asked him if he could ever do anything for him, just let him know, and he said, give me a job. So he managed to sneak in and get a job when he was 17 at Bisbee. So So he worked in the mines for a while, and then I think he was age, 29 or 30 maybe, he went back and got a degree at the University of Arizona, which is where he met my mom.
So while you were at Arizona, did you have any professors or classmates that really influenced you into what you did with your profession?
I wish I could even remember the guy's name. The most memorable thing I walked out of the university with was the guy who taught our mine management class. He says, when you get out and you get into industry, wherever you go, you find your high status friend in the company. And that's something that I paid attention to. I don't even remember the guy's name now. But that was a lasting and much repeated thing that I've carried with me throughout my career, because it is important when you're the new guy on the block to find your high status friend and get your mentor and crawl under their wing.
So how did you get your first professional job?
Well, Arizona had a pretty good recruiting program, and the guys would come through and recruit. The students would all sign up and interview. And it was at a time when EEO was pretty important in the United States, and people don't even know what that is anymore. But the Equal Opportunity Employment, they had quotas of hires that companies needed to try to achieve. And so I was, to the best of my knowledge, I was the second female graduate from the University of Arizona in mining engineering. The first had graduated just maybe 6 months before me or a year before me, Denise Sylvester. So I was the second. There just weren't women in the industry. And so when you went and interviewed for these jobs, it tended to be the bigger companies who were looking to fill those quotas. I went to work for Exxon, Monterey Coal Company, the underground division of Exxon. Funny story, though, I interviewed Bucyrus Erie, which is now a part of Caterpillar. They came on campus and they were interviewing, and there weren't very many students who'd signed up to interview, so it was everybody was running around saying, okay, we got to get somebody to go into these recruiters and interview with them and just talk to them. And so I went in and I talked to them, and then they come back, and then they wanted me to go out to Illinois and look at their dragline erections and all of this. And so I saw dragline, because they were build these things on site because they're so big. And then drill rig, I went out to Eureka where they were building a drill rig. And so they flew me around, and they made me a job offer, and Exxon made me a job offer. And I swear to God, I'm not kidding. They offered me the position of erection engineer. Sorry. But they didn't really think through what the position title was. I could have passed that business card around.
Clearly, you were a woman in a very man-dominated field. So when you went to work for Exxon, what did you do? What were your positions? What were your job duties?
I started out in mine planning, underground mine planning for coal mining. And I had gone to an open pit surface hard rock mining school at Arizona. And so going to work for Monterey was just a absolute new experience, because we had to beg at Arizona at the time to get them to even do an introduction to coal mining class, because it just wasn't what the university did. So I'd actually taken a class on coal mining, so I actually knew what room and pillar meant, but I really didn't know much about coal mining, which is why I remembered my mine management guy's, whatever his name was, his recommendation to find my high status friend. And I found Gary Skaggs, who was our senior engineer. And Gary, to this day, if you know Gary, you would look at me and you'd look at Gary and you'd say, those two are the oddest pair to become mentor and mentee, and we've been friends. He is the engineer's engineer. He was from West Virginia. He knew everything there was to know about. He's very technically oriented and knows everything there is to know about underground coal mining. And he, for some unknown reason, took me under his wing and helped me to understand what I needed to do in order to do underground mine design for coal mines.
What was it like being a woman engineer trying to work in this male-dominated industry back then? And do you have any good stories about about trying to get your business done?
At Monterey Coal Company, because it was Exxon and because they had a pretty progressive program for hiring all the straight A students and the ethnic, and there wasn't so much ethnic that was available, but the women. It was, I'd almost say, a sanitized environment. There were a lot of women by percentage working there. That I can say I worked with. My first job out of school in 1979, there was probably 20% women working there, which was absolutely unheard of because, like I say, they recruited straight A students and women. So I didn't qualify for the straight A student piece, but I'm convinced I got the job because I was a woman. And they had offered Exxon interviewed at the school. It wasn't Monterey per se. So when I interviewed, they made me an offer at the Highland mine uranium mine in Wyoming, and also at Monterey Coal Company in Carlinville, Illinois. I chose to go to Carlinville because my dad had been in uranium his entire career, and I wanted to do something else and make my own name in the industry. What I know now is if you have an opportunity to take advantage of anybody who's going to give you a hand up in the business, whether it's your dad or your friend or whoever, you should take advantage of that if you have it. But I decided I was going to make it on my own, by golly, and went off to mine coal in Illinois. So. But when I left Monterey, this is my favorite story of all times because it was very characteristic. I met my husband and we went off and traveled for a while after I left Monterey. And then when we went back and started looking for jobs, it was kind of find a place where there's multiple coal mining operations because my husband's an engineer as well. And so we went and traveled around the country, spent all our money, and then we went back to my parents' house in Grand Junction, Colorado, and looked around at what kind of mining was going on. So there was the coal mines in the Paonia area, and so we went up there, and my dad drove us up there, and he dropped me off at U.S. Steel's office, and he took Frank up to another mine, and we knocked on the door and just cold called at these mines. And I walk in to U.S. Steel, and I said, "Can I see the manager?" And they said, "Okay, well, sure." And they introduced me to Lloyd Miller. And Lloyd Miller made quite a profound impression on me because he looked at me, took one look at me, and he says, I said, I'm looking for a job. I'm a mining engineer, and I've worked for Monterey Coal Company for a couple of years, and I'd really like to work here for you. And he looked at me, and he said, "I don't have any use for women working in the coal mines. I had a woman show up this morning to work, and she had shaved her head bald because she said she didn't want to look sexy to the men underground." And he says, and he looked straight at me, he says, "That woman wouldn't look sexy to any man anywhere. She's as big around as she is tall." And I'm like, okay. So I'm thinking this interview is starting off real well. He says, "Well, come on into my office." And he grabs his general mine foreman and he grabs his safety guy. And so these three guys are sitting in the office and I'm sitting there. And so we end up talking, just standard yakking away for, I bet it was a couple hours. And then at the end of the interview, we stand up and Lloyd takes one look at me and he says, "Well, I don't hire the engineers." And I'm thinking, you just wasted 2 hours of my time and you don't hire the engineers? And he says, well, you got to go talk to Glenn Sides over in East Carbon. And so I said, okay. And he gives me all the information, and I'm dumb enough to say, okay, let's just go. And and then I stand up to leave, and he looks at me and he goes, well, at least you're big. So that was my interview with Lloyd Miller. Subsequent to that, I learned that general mine foreman who was in that interview got transferred to the office in East Carbon, which was where the engineers were hired. And I go over and I do sit down with Glenn Sides and I interview with him, and that all works well. And so I'm interviewing with him, and then I go in to interview with the assistant general mine foreman. And this assistant general mine foreman comes in, and he's a talkative guy. You know, it was great. You know, anybody could talk to him. And then the general superintendent walked in, and he's this crusty old guy. And he walks in, sits down, and Mike and I are still just back and forth and back and forth. And Paul Watson just sits there and looks over the top of his glasses, glowering at me. And I'm just like, wow, who is this guy? and finally, he looks over the top of his glasses and he goes, you know how to set a spad? And I said, you mean a surveying spad? He says, it's the only kind of spad I know. I said, yeah. And he got up and walked out. That was the end of interview. So I get the job, and Dick Conkle, the guy that was the general mine foreman in the interview, he says, he and I ended up carpooling together. And he says, you know, the minute you walked out the door, Lloyd picked up the phone, called Paul Watson, and he said, if you have to hire one of them, meaning a woman, this is the one to hire. But it was a curious interview, I got to admit. You know, a lot of people today would probably walk away from the situation when someone says, I don't have any use for you working here.
But you got the job.
But I got the job.
So earlier in your career, there's a point where you go from being a newbie to actually getting to the point where you think you're an engineer. Do you remember what that transition was? Was there a project, or was it, you know, getting in and managing people, or what really got you to the point where you thought you knew what you were doing finally? Where
you transitioned to knowing something?
Yeah.
Working at U.S. Steel was that time, and it was because I went to work in the coal mines in 1979. And the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act was passed in 1977. And all the states started trying to get their programs, their state delegate programs organized. And in Utah, which was where I was working, that happened in 1981. And I went to work for U.S. Steel in 1980. And so the regulatory program in Utah and Colorado was about the same time. And we had a mine in Utah and a mine in Colorado and a coal cleaning plant in Utah, sorry. And so the Glenn Sides, my boss, the chief engineer, decided that rather than contracting out the permitting, that we were going to do that in-house, because he had this new engineer that he could put to work on it. So I got going with the other guys in the department, and we did the permitting for the Wellington coal cleaning plant, the Geneva mine in Utah, and the Somerset mine in Colorado. So I worked for U.S. Steel for 5 years, and in the first 3 years or so, I did coal mine permitting exclusively and worked with the regulatory authorities and to get these permits approved. And once we got the permitting done, then I ended up getting transferred to the coal cleaning plant, where I was a plant engineer responsible for product quality and refuse disposal and all that sort of thing, and all the compliance at the mine in Utah and the coal cleaning plant. So it was basically, by the time I left U.S. Steel, and I didn't leave it because I wanted to, it was because Steel sold their Western operations to Kaiser at the time. And at that time, I was 7 months pregnant with my second son. And we had heard rumors that Kaiser was going to keep the maintenance guy and the environmental guy on board. And then they came out one day and started walking around. They figured out who the maintenance guy and the environmental guy were. And all of a sudden, the environmental guy was 7 months pregnant, and they kind of rethought that and said, maybe we don't need to keep the environmental guy. So I ended up doing some consulting work for them until the baby was born. But I think that the decision was made because I was pregnant and they didn't want to take that on.
So you've transitioned into where I wanted to go. So you started your career off in the coal mines, but you're certainly much better known for the field of environmental and permitting. So tell us a little more about how you transitioned into that field.
By the time I was 5 years out of school, I'd finished working with U.S. Steel, I had 5 years more experience on the permitting and environmental side than anybody on the planet, because no self-respecting mining engineer wanted to do that part. That's why the new kid got to do it. So I had more experience than anybody else. After the kids were born and I was out of a job, my husband was still working underground at the mines, and we were watching the want ads to see what kind of jobs came up. And so there was a position that came open in the hard rock group at the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, the state. And so Frank's going, well, you should apply for that. And I'm going, oh man, I really don't want to work for the state. But, he wanted to get out of working underground. And so if we moved to Salt Lake, there'd be better opportunity for work. And I said, well, you're just as qualified for that job as I am. You should apply for it too. And so we both applied for the same job. And as it turned out, we later found out that we were number one and number two candidates. Fortunately for me, he was the number one candidate and got the job. And I was the number two candidate, which was perfect because I didn't want the job. And he really did want the job because he wanted a professional job getting out of the coal mines. And for me, I'd worked with the regulators and I just didn't want to go there. But as he was working at Oil, Gas, and Mining, he got to know all the guys in the coal side, and they were all my buddies because I'd just worked with them for quite a long time. And there was this guy who had just taken over this leasing company. And I probably shouldn't mention his name just because I think that there was a lot of litigious action that went around this story. So I'll leave his name out of the mix. But he had taken over this leasing company, and they had foreclosed. They had financed the buildings at a coal mining a coal lease. So the guy had picked up the coal lease and picked up these buildings by taking over with his investor group this leasing company that had foreclosed on these buildings. And so then the Jordanelle Dam was starting to be built up in the Park City area, and they needed sand and gravel. And the way this coal deposit was it was overlain by a sand and gravel deposit, and then you'd go into the underground coal seam. And this guy, well, I should take one step back. In the state of Utah at the time, the sand and gravel went with the mineral or with the surface rights, and the coal lease went with the mineral rights. So they were separately regulated. And so he was out there one day on his bulldozer, and the property owners, because the property didn't belong to him. He just had the mineral rights coal lease. So he's out there with his bulldozer pulling some gravel out, thinking he's going to make some money over at the dam. And the surface owners show up and say, you can't do that. We own this land. And he says, oh, no, I'm just getting access to my coal seam. And I have right of entry here. And so then the surface owners went down to Oil, Gas, and Mining and said, you need to go talk to this guy because he's mining coal without a permit. And so Oil, Gas, and Mining comes up and looks around and says, what are you doing here? You're mining coal without a permit. Oh, no, I'm mining sand and gravel for the Jordanelle Dam. So he took both sides of it, and you don't have jurisdiction over sand and gravel. So he got a cease and desist order for, what was it, $30,000 a day. And he needed to file a reclamation plan with oil, gas, and mining for his coal mine that had been inappropriately developed. So my buddies over at Oil, Gas, and Mining mentioned to Frank that this guy needed somebody to put a reclamation plan together, and I'd just done 3 of them, and nobody else had done any of them when it really came right down to it. So it was kind of a good marriage, but it also brought on it was a good learning experience for me, because this guy, so I agreed to come on board, and I'm putting together his reclamation plan for the project. And he comes down one day and he says, "So what do you want your title to be, Barb? Do you want to be general manager? Do you want to be mine superintendent? What do you want to be?" I said, "I think I'll just be engineer. Engineer is a good title." And so I wasn't very far along in my career. And I usually, when you're young and spry and you just want to get ahead and be the big boss and take on the big title. And I don't know what made me say, just make me the engineer. But boy, am I glad I did. Because he ended up doing some interesting shenanigans, shall I say. He was running a leasing company. The whole time I worked there, I worked for him for 2 years. He never paid a dime to Social Security of employment tax when I was there. He would take money from one company and pay the payroll of another company, and he was just moving chess pieces all the time. And ultimately, there was a grand jury investigation into him, and I can remember when they started, that grand jury investigation started, and the Attorney General's office was coming down to the guys in oil, gas, and mining, saying, "So what was this Filas person's role in this?" And my buddy Randy Harden, at the engineer, said she was just the engineer, because I had this guy sign, as the president of the company, all the applications, and all I did was certify the engineering drawings and that sort of thing. So I heard a rumor that he ended up in jail. It was pretty clear that he bankrupted all of his investors, and I never even got a subpoena to testify.
Shady guy in mining. Imagine that.
Imagine that.
So how did you transition into what you spent a lot of your time of your life to Knight Piésold?
After that incident, I was looking for yet another job, and we had decided that we wanted to move away from Utah for a variety of reasons. And Frank was done working for the government, because he'd done his stint, and so there was a job opening in Grand Junction, which was my hometown, and with Atlas Minerals, and so I applied for that job. And I think I was number 2 for that position too, but the guy that actually got the job offer first failed the drug test. So I was able to get in and as once more the number 2 position. But so I went to work for in Grand Junction. Frank was still working for the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining at the time, so we were kind of commuting. And Atlas had mines in southwestern Colorado, southeastern Utah. So it was like we made a pact early on that we weren't going to sign any of the regulatory documents or letters that went into the state, because it would have been Filas versus Filas, because he was regulating the hard rock program, and which would have been all the uranium mines, and I was working in the uranium mines in southeastern Utah. So it was always my boss would sign we'd do all the work, and his boss and my boss would sign all the paperwork, so that it never looked like Filas versus Filas.
So,
and then we were transitioning to Knight Piésold. So I was working for Atlas, and then they wanted to transfer me out to the gold bar mine in Eureka, Nevada. And so Atlas decided to create a position for Frank as a foreman in the mine, in the open pit gold mine. So now that was my transition. I transitioned out of coal, went to Utah or Salt Lake with the coal mining job. Then I started with Atlas in uranium, and then I transitioned into open pit gold. I was living in Eureka, Nevada, and I just, over time, and that was a fun time. I mean, it was a time when the regulations, all the water pollution control programs were being organized, and the Nevada Mining Association was very active, and I was testifying and in that process, and that was a lot of fun. But living in rural Eureka, Nevada, kind of started wearing on me, and we had Don East ran Knight Piésold, and I can remember. I should take a step back, because when they wanted me to move to Eureka, I really didn't want to go. I was really comfortable living in Grand Junction. My kids could go to grandma's for daycare, and they loved going to grandma's, and so it was really kind of a nice place, and I didn't want to go. But Keith Hulley was the president of Atlas at the time, and Keith took me aside when he wanted me to move to Eureka, and he says, "Barb, sometime in your career, you're going to have to decide between engineering and operations, because if you stay in the middle, you're going to stay on the bottom." So he was trying to get me to go to operations, because I'd been pretty much working in the office for most of the time. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And I went out to the mine, and I was the environmental guy out at the mine. So I don't know that I ever really was the operations guy. And then I spent a couple of years out at the Gold Bar mine in Eureka, Nevada, and Don was out there one day, and we're talking about how we were going to build. We were building an expansion to our tailings area, and he wants to put in this. The design was they were going to put in this under drainage system that was a herringbone design, and then a gravel layer to help dewater the tailings so that it'd get more efficient settling and drying of the tails. And so we're in my office one day, and he's the guy that was managing that process wanted him to cut some cost out of the design. So he decided he was going to take out a lot of that under drainage system out of the tailings facility. And I'm saying, well, that doesn't seem like that's such a good idea. But, and basically I told Don that if you can sell it to the regulators, then, because he's getting on the board and he's writing Q equals KIA, and it's, we can get the water out of here and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, and I just told him, as far as I'm concerned, it's eyewash, because you get that consolidated tailings and you don't get you get lateral drainage, but you aren't going to get a lot of vertical drainage. And so if you have a big pipe network or a smaller pipe network, as long as you have the drainage, the drainage layer, you should be able to get the thing dewatered. But if you have a network of pipes, it's going to drain better. Everybody just knows that. I said, but if you can convince the state that it's going to work and it's going to keep the head off the liner, because we were using soil liners with cyanide in a cyanide containment pond. So I don't want my liner to leak, and I don't want it to saturate my liner and go into the groundwater, because then I know I'm going to have an environmental headache. So, but when I told him it was eyewash, he just, the next thing I know, he's asking me to come to work for him. At that time, Knight Piésold didn't have an environmental capacity. Okay. So there was no one in working in environmental. It was civil and geotechnical. And so, and ultimately, when I decided to go to work for Knight Piésold, I thought I was going in to start up, to be a part of a new capability. Well, Don and Stan Dempsey got together through Stan's Denver Mining Finance Company, and they formed what they called Denver Knight Piésold. So it was a new environmental company, and they bought out Gormley Consultants, which was, John Gormley had what was left over of the Dapolonia group in the Denver area, and it was a group of 3 guys, I think, who came in, and then I kind of got shoved down John's throat, because Don had already made the arrangements to hire me, and then this deal with he and Stan worked out, and John's company got bought. So for the first 6 months I worked for John Gormley, I'd go home in the evening and I'd tell Frank that God, if it weren't for Don, I wouldn't stay with this company. And after the first 6 months, it'd be, God, if it weren't for John, I wouldn't stay with this company. So Don and John were great guys.
Talk a little bit about your years with, how long were you with Knight Piésold? And I know you basically built a pretty good business there. So let's talk a little bit about your career with those guys.
Yeah. Well, Knight Piésold was, and when I let me circle back. When I left Atlas, I can remember going up, telling Keith Hulley, we had a board meeting that I'd given a presentation, and I kind of tendered my resignation right about that time. And Keith, who had told me, if you got to pick between engineering and operations, if you stay in the middle, you stay on the bottom. And I actually went back to Keith and said, and now I've really decided that I am going to do the engineering piece. And so it's your advice that got me here. It's your advice that got me out. So I went to Denver, moved to Denver, and worked with John Gormley, and John was a great guy to work with. But his background was very kind of different than mine. And it was at a time when the Nevada gold mining industry was very much booming. I went to work for Knight Piésold in 1989. And it was crazy booming in Nevada. And I'd been working in Nevada since the law was written. And John hadn't worked much in Nevada at all. And so it was, sometimes we'd have to butt heads a little bit because he was my boss and he wanted to review everything. And John was a good micromanager. I think that he's a dear friend of mine even to this day. But he always he was so careful, and he would change in to with in a report, that kind of detail. And so it was difficult to get things done. So I got to the point where I'd say, okay, and here's the document that we're going to issue. The client's already reviewed it and is happy with it. You do your review, and then we'll get it out later this afternoon. So he didn't have the opportunity to change in to with. But yeah, and Knight Piésold, over time, we grew the environmental capacity. It started with a guy, John and one other guy and me in Denver, and then there was one guy in Wyoming who we didn't have a lot of direct interaction with, and he ultimately went off on his own. But we grew that group, and ultimately I took over the environmental group at Knight Piésold. And I turned into John when it came down to being a micromanager. And one of my epiphany moments in my career was when I was busy trying to, I was managing all the projects. I had hired a bunch of young, really sharp young people to help me with the work that we were doing. And one day I looked up from my office, and I saw 3 of these guys literally lined up outside my office waiting to come in and get me to make a call on something they were working on. And my epiphany moment was, wow, if that was me standing in that line, I'd be looking for another job. Well, I can tell you all 3 of those guys. One of them is like the assistant attorney general in Colorado. She went back and got a law degree. One of them's running the NEPA program for wood environmental consultants, and one of them has been doing independent consulting on her own, supporting her family for years. They're all very, very capable people, and I was the one I was doing what my boss drove me crazy, but I didn't realize I was doing it myself until I saw them outside my office one day. It was a good aha moment.
So, a lot of time with Knight Piésold. How many years?
20, just shy of 20. And it was kind of an interesting process. And we went through a globalization in, I think it was late late 90s, early 2000s. I don't remember the dates exactly. But we globalized the company. We didn't consolidate the company, but all the companies that used to be like Knight Piésold in the United States was a Colorado corporation, and in Canada it was whatever they do in Canada, and Australia it was whatever they do in Australia. But we all had the name Knight Piésold. So to our clients, they logically thought we were all Knight Piésold. So we decided to build an overarching, kind of similar to AIME as to the member societies of AIME. So we have this overarching group called Knight Piésold Holdings Limited that all the companies were affiliated with, and that gave us our common name. It gave us a board of directors, and I sat on the board of directors for KPHIL. And Don East, who started the practice in the United States, became the global CEO. And so one of my partners, in fact, it was my interviewer's brother, Jim Arnold, who became the president of the U.S. practice of Knight Piésold. And I will have you know that Tim and I have been friends for many, many years. And his mother at my wedding told me that she wished that I would have married one of her sons. And I told Jim when we became business partners that this was the next best thing that we could have done for their mom, is just be business partners, because that was as close as we were really ever going to get to being married.